For virtual patches to work, you need to have two things. One thing is obviously threat intelligence, to be able to even know about what vulnerabilities there are, because every single virtual patch is on spec made for individual vulnerabilities. So right now, Patchstack has over 11,000 unique virtual patches, which is like by far the largest collection of any kind of security rules in the WordPress ecosystem. You need to be able to know exactly when and where to deploy that, because you don't want to have your website kind of like run through 11,000 rules for every single page request, right?
Hello everyone, this is another episode of the B2B Growth Hacking Blueprint podcast, and today I have Oliver Sild with me, founder, CEO of Patchstack. Hi Oliver, thanks for stopping by. How are you doing?
Hey, thanks for inviting me. Doing well.
That's the spirit. Well, what I want to talk to you about is security. Funny enough, it's one of my favorite topics, primarily due to the fact that I'm extremely paranoid, and I also tend to believe deeply in diversification and safety first. Patchstack has been the largest and the most reputable vendor for vulnerability management for WordPress-based websites. WordPress is powering 43% of the web, give or take, or 44, depending on how you count that. As far as I know, you also manage Drupal websites and Joomla websites, and they're expanding into the rest of the PHP ecosystem and further on the larger portion of the ecosystem. But even as it stands, about half of the web is running on the PHP platforms that you already manage. And that's a significantly massive percentage of vulnerabilities that you're taking care of and protecting people's websites. So tell us, how did you start Patchstack, and kind of what's the path that you took from start to where you are right now?
Yeah, I actually got into security super early when I was like 14 or 15 years old through video games, hacking and all that kind of stuff. So that also continued happening when I went to study computer networking in the local vocational school. Hacking and like breaking things was always kind of like something that I think got like a lot, like adrenaline kind of like rushes all of the time. So that was like naturally how I think got into security. Ultimately, I was invited into Estonian Cyber Defense League, which is like a military kind of like voluntary unit here, where I got, I think, more exposure into like what it actually looks like to be on the defender's point of view. Because of like my ex-hacker past, in a sense, I already knew like what the bad guys are doing in the sense of how they get access to different websites, what their motivations could be, and things like that. And during my studies, I started essentially like an agency. We did like Joomla e-commerce websites, mostly focused on Joomla back in the day, but also like some custom PHP development. We already back in the name called it like a security agency. So our focus was that if we're building e-commerce experiences or if we're building any kind of websites, let's take my experience with the security and kind of like port that into it. So we're not necessarily offering our customers just like a one go, we're going to build you a website and then we are kind of like, disappearing to another customer. We wanted to make sure that if we're doing that service, we actually take security kind of like as part of that process and offer them solutions that are maintenance, that they have ongoing security going forward with that and so forth. So that actually started us getting into like the phase where we kind of started building Patchstack internally for ourselves because we needed to understand like, okay, what's happening with all of the components that we build websites for our customers, what's happening with those, what those developers are doing who built those components, all these kind of things. So that has kind of like by now built into this whole platform of managing vulnerabilities and providing the fastest mitigation to those issues, because speed in security is everything. You can only protect what you know about. So in a nutshell, that's what Patchstack today is doing, is covering this entire life cycle of security vulnerabilities and making sure that we are able to protect the web applications and the customers before hackers even know that they have vulnerabilities in there.
Super helpful. And based on the latest security survey for last year for WordPress, you have uncovered about 52% of all security vulnerabilities within WordPress. How are you normally approaching that? As in, what does the team look like? Your pen test engineers and everyone else who's spending the time to actually uncover this opportunity?
So I would say like when we look into like, so we're over 30 people. If you look into the company, it's like a little bit of, we're a very R&D heavy company in that sense, where like in the WordPress ecosystem, we don't talk about with those terms because we need to make sure that if we talk to people, they understand what we are actually saying. So but like if we would be talking about what Patchstack does in the infosec community, in a cybersecurity specifically, then Patchstack is pretty much a threat intelligence company. More than half of the people in our company are somewhat or in the basically, in the threat intelligence team, doing vulnerability triaging, vulnerability research, pen testing, all that kind of stuff. And then the second half is, product and marketing, basically. So very, very big chunk of our kind of company resources are heavily going in that direction. And I think what has made it possible for us to be in this situation is that when we started the company, we wanted to kind of like cover the entire life cycle of open source vulnerabilities, right? So we wanted to make sure that we are in every piece, or like every part of the journey whenever a security vulnerability has been found in some sort of software, which then affects the users and so forth. So how we've kind of like approached that is that, first of all, we want to be around the moment when a vulnerability is being given found by anyone. So we created like a gamified bug bounty program like 4 years ago, where if you find a security vulnerability in any WordPress plugins, for example, and you report it to Patchstack, we are actually paying you for kind of like contributing that security knowledge. We also wanted to make sure that we can help those vulnerabilities to get fixed as well. So we started collaborating with plugin developers directly, so the software vendors. So we work with over 600 WordPress plugins have actually set up Patchstack as their security point of contact. So we even work together with the European Union to build a platform which allows the open source kind of, or like in general, software developers to set up vulnerability disclosure programs and ultimately to become compliant with the new Cyber Resilience Act, which is like a new kind of like a GDPR, but for software security, that was just passed as a law end of last year. And then there's this third pillar of what we are doing, which is like, now we've like been around detecting those new vulnerabilities and then helping the vendors patch those vulnerabilities. But now we also want to make sure that we are around when end customers and applications that are actually vulnerable to those issues can also be mitigated. And for that, we have a SaaS platform which we offer to developers and to hosting companies, who can then just auto mitigate those security vulnerabilities with the virtual patching, which we do for them. So that essentially covers the entire life cycle of the entire kind of like a vulnerability life in that sense.
Pretty incredible. And your team has uncovered over 1,000 vulnerabilities across plugins that have over 100,000 installations.
Yeah.
And that's pretty significant. And I just want to kind of move over that for a moment. But essentially, each plugin installed on 100,000 websites, and you have 1,000 vulnerabilities across plugins like that. So essentially, we're talking about millions of potentially, well, not potentially, actually affected websites that are potentially vulnerable. I want to also kind of open a separate bracket that WordPress is the largest CMS by large, running the vast majority of the internet. I would not, we are also running pretty high scale WordPress websites ourselves, some DevRigs, some generating hundreds of millions of page views, some Fortune 500, and like it's a pretty large mix. So I'm definitely not bashing WordPress. In fact, I think it's the equivalent of Windows. Every single corporate sector is running Windows. It's kind of just the predominant operating system, meaning that it's also the one that's breached the most because they're the most hackers incentivized to attack Windows for that reason alone. That also means that half of the planet, or at least 44% is running WordPress, and that also rounds up to about 50% with Joomla and Drupal that you're already running. And as much as we care about the open source community and making sure that we have full control over the source code and everything that we're running in-house, we're not dependent on third-party SaaS companies for our retaining data and user know-how and kind of everything else. We're running our own database centers here. What are the common challenges that you're dealing with larger websites, kind of B2Bs, fintech, healthcare, B2B SaaS, hardware companies, and so forth, running on top of a WordPress stack when it comes to vulnerability? What are some of the common, let's say, XSS, SQL injections, and some of the other OWASP top 10 risks hidden within WordPress websites?
Cross-site scripting is the most kind of like common one. As soon as you have users involved, then cross-site request forgery is becoming a problem as well. But when we look into like what are getting mass exploited, are often like very like difficult, like logic-based errors, which allow you to kind of like do remote code execution, arbitrary like options changes, file uploads, all these kind of things, which are very hard to, I would say, detect by, let's say, generic firewalls and things like that. When we look into the statistics in general, when it comes to security vulnerabilities, one big problem that we have is that about like over 30% of the vulnerabilities that, for example, were discovered last year were actually not patched by the vendor itself on time.
So they're 0 day or what?
In theory, they are a 0 day. but they're like just vulnerabilities that are getting published, but the vendor, for example, maybe may have abandoned that plugin, so they don't even do maintenance for it anymore. So there's like a lot of 30% of the vulnerabilities that we publish in such a way don't receive a patch by the official developer. There's like hundreds of thousands, millions of websites that run those plugins. Inside of the WordPress admin panel, they don't even see that this plugin is out to date. Like even if you remove that plugin, very often WordPress plugins repository or the plugin review team, they are closing those plugins down so that you cannot download it anymore. But if you're a user and if you have like WordPress admin panel and you look into like the installed plugins, all you see it's up to date. It doesn't give you any indication that this plugin has actually been closed, and you get like this false sense of security that I'm my website is up to date, so whatever updates that are available for that plugin, they are there. But in reality, this is closed down for security reasons, and you don't receive any kinds of updates for that at all. Visibility into vulnerabilities in those cases is super important, and something kind of like that adds up to it, which we see, I would say, more on the enterprise case, is that the more we look into upmarket, the less companies are actually reliant on like WordPress built-in, like auto-updating and things like that. Especially on the upmarket where you're running basically Git-based workflows, you have like immutable systems, stuff like that, which is great for security on one hand, but on the other hand, it actually increases the exposure timeline for how long the website is basically vulnerable. For last week, we released an article about the vulnerability, which was basically disclosed just now in April. Every time we release or like publish a vulnerability entry into our data set and notify our customers, we also deploy what is called virtual patch. So virtual patch is basically like auto mitigation rule for the vulnerability, which is automatically targeting that vulnerable function in the site and basically mitigating the vulnerability without changing underlying code or basically making any changes to the functionality of the site itself. Something that we've realized is that when we deploy those out, we see from the entire network like how much time it actually takes for a vulnerability from getting published to becoming basically mass exploited, right? And the average time is like down to like few hours. If you don't have auto updates enabled, and in 30% of the cases where you don't have updates available at all, what are your kind of like options there? And I think having like some sort of like vulnerability management as the first thing to even know about those vulnerabilities as fast as possible is one thing. But I think we are getting to a situation where basically vulnerability mitigation like virtual patching is becoming completely essential, and even more so in the enterprise market, because virtual patching allows you to basically bypass SDLC without staying exposed, right? So there's going to be a lot of changes, I think, on the market in terms of like how security will have to be deployed also on the enterprise market segment.
This is pretty critical, and I think one of the reasons why it's so important to speak about that is that we are primarily operating in, let's say, European markets, North America, countries that are kind of higher economical standard, and also more progressive countries moving with less regulation and kind of fewer obstacles. The negative of that is that there's also less control when it comes to the public firewall. And I'm going to give a couple of examples here. I was teaching a secure Java course in CERN in 2012 or so, and there were so many different regulations out there in Switzerland, particularly Switzerland and France, because making a pretty critical mistake might actually nuke half of the continent because of the Hadron Collider. And I was actually dealing with PostgreSQL security, working with the team out there. And of course, this was pretty critical, preventing any sort of SQL injections, kind of blind SQL, and some of the other issues out there. So in certain sectors and certain segments, government also included, or military or defense, there's more scrutiny out there. So security is higher by definition. Another example is I was also teaching a secure web application course in Saudi Aramco, the largest company in Saudi Arabia. And even as I was giving examples on site, again, a decade ago, if I open up a torrent tracker or Kali Linux's website, just as an example to showcase something, the next day, the entire country has blocked the website because their defense and SecOps teams and everyone else is pretty much spending 24/7 monitoring traffic, taking a look at every single movement, every single public resource open, and if everything gets flagged, they immediately shut it off on a kind of on a firewall level for the entire country. But we literally don't see that anywhere in Europe or North America because there's freedom of speech and there's democracy and there's a lot of that going on. But it also means that a lot of vulnerabilities are left open nevertheless. So right now, again, if we take an example, small and medium enterprise or mid-market company running WordPress, meaning 30, 50, $100 million, $200 million in revenue running on top of WordPress, what are the, let's say, the top 3 ways for them to stay protected? Picking the right hosting, setting up Patchstack internally, working with a Patchstack partner, or what are the most common ways for them to stay protected and kind of increase the level of security on top of WordPress?
The way how to always approach it is to think about layers, right? So when you think about protecting WordPress application itself, there's multiple layers where you need to have security covered. It starts with the network layer, right? So before anything hits the server or even the application that is hosted inside of the server, you should basically filter out like all kinds of like trash traffic on the network layer, using Cloudflare or any kind of like, DNS based firewall in that regard. This is the place where you do that. It's getting more and more difficult actually to apply protection on this layer because of all the kind of like AI capabilities that are try to mimic the actual real user type. So they are using headless browsers, and they basically completely mimic how a real person would basically browse the web. So this is the security on this kind of layer is getting more and more difficult. But then the next layer is the server layer, right? So where do you host your stuff? AWS or do you use like a managed hosting service, like managed WordPress hosting service or something like that? This is the place where you need to like really make sure that the hosting configurations are very well done. So in that regard, like if you don't know how to do it yourself, you should go and pick a very, very good hosting company that actually knows what they're doing. Obviously, you want to make sure that the physical racks are in a secure place as well. A lot of companies use Google Cloud for that sense, because literally Google data centers are like having like armed guarding and stuff like that. So this is as far as you can go when thinking about security, right? And then on the hosting side, or like on the server level, actually, what you need to definitely do is set up like intrusion detection. So all kinds of like malware scanning, malware detection solution. These need to all sit in that kind of like server side of the things. And additionally also like, backups, like, making sure that everything is backed up frequently. You have tests on the backups, that backups themselves are also scanned, all that kind of stuff. And then the third layer is essentially the application itself, what you are basically trying to protect, right? And inside of this application, you need to have basically vulnerability management, vulnerability detection. You also need to make sure that the users, the sessions, everything is secured. So, you deploy two-factor authentication on the privileged accounts. You also think about who even gets privileged accounts. I don't think that most of the people who have WordPress administrative privileges should ever have administrative privileges. So these are all the things that you need to think of. And that also boils down, like outside of all those layers is also the human factor, right? So the people who have the administrative privileges, how do they think about their own internal, I would say like their personal security practices? Because when we look into how WordPress websites are getting hacked, it's basically you split it in two halves. One is security vulnerabilities in WordPress plugins, themes, and core. Majority of it coming from the plugins and themes, which is like 99.9%. The second half is essentially poor cyber hygiene, which means that very poor like password management, using basic admin passwords and stuff like that, and then session hijacking as well. So much of the malware that is currently being kind of like spread around is essentially browser widgets, random applications that you install on your devices and your laptop, that is basically just going after your Apple keychain, trying to get your passwords from your browser, things like that, or just going after sessions, just taking active session cookies, because then you can also bypass two-factor authentication. So these are the two things really, and these are the things that need to get solved. So if you think about what you need to basically secure WordPress websites, it's vulnerability management and mitigation for all the security vulnerabilities, and the second half is really securing the user accounts on those websites.
The level of security of organization essentially boils down to the weakest link, which is oftentimes the secretary, the accountant, or someone else who, as you said, an organization that has admin accounts that shouldn't be admins. we had a leak about a year ago from an organization that was a holding company, and then all executives of the holding company demanded they have access for whatever reason. And this ended up with like 60 admin accounts of people who have never accessed the website, and one of them had a dictionary keyword, which was essentially his name 1 through 6. And needless to say, that was breached and led to a breach, which was essentially pretty hilarious. But again, this was a company policy. There was not much we can do around that. And having a more or less open-ended admin account was what ended up hitting the website. But in a nutshell, kind of what are you brought in a lot of the kind of secure risks on the human side. I think that social engineering is also helping a lot with phishing attacks, with lots of other scam going on out there. But what else would you say kind of sits on top or in addition to these layers? Let's say open Wi-Fi passwords or popular Chrome extensions that are being set up as well. They're potentially monitoring tracking, or some of the other lesser known things that specifically non-technical persona who isn't thinking or spending a lot of time thinking about. If they say, my system seems to be secure, but something else is happening.
Yeah, I would say like mostly it boils down into like those very poor practices, like reusing passwords across multiple things. Like I would always tell people to use something like 1Password, or I don't know, like you can use like KeePass that is also open. There's like, you know, Bitwarden and things like that, which allow you to kind of like have like password management tool. So just for the sole purpose of you not using the same password over and over again in multiple places, because otherwise at one point you are going to have a password leak controllable by you. You need to understand that, because, you know, if you go to like haveibeenpwned.com, for example, you can check whether any of, you know, your passwords connected to any of your emails have leaked, and like they will at one point leak. So you're going so if you don't have a password management system set up where you kind of like randomly generate passwords for every single website that you log in, once a single leak happens, then all of your accounts can become compromised. So this is something that people really need to think about as well. So you mentioned those Chrome extensions, for example. Like this is exactly one of those places where huge amount of those Chrome extensions are basically used to get access to your session cookies, to the information about like how do you log into the websites and things like that. So you need to really be careful about like what kind of Chrome extensions you are using, because they are very specifically used for that. And then another thing that maybe we need to take into account is like AI, right? Especially when it comes to phishing, because AI is incredibly good at basically scamming you. So I would say like a week ago, there was a study released by a company called Hunt, which is basically doing kind of like a phishing, like a platform where you can do internal company kind of like social engineering, kind of like pen testing, red teaming, right? And they've already said that AI has basically surpassed the excellence. They measured the output of like how likely is that the phishing or like a spear phishing campaign goes through, and AI is already like better than like elite level like social engineering red teamers, which is like crazy, because that means that, you know, now everyone has this capability at their hand. You can scam in every single language you wish to scam someone in, and you can fully automate all of that. In fact, Troy Hunt, the founder of Have I Been Pwned website, he got just recently hacked because of the social engineering. Phishing is going to become a increasingly bigger problem. So the human factor is like, you know, the AI is going to outcompete us in that regard completely, and we need to be very, very careful in terms of, you know, what we click on, what are the things that, you know, we're kind of like misled to think and do in the internet and things like that. So it's definitely more challenging than ever.
One of the clever phishing campaigns I saw the other day was an email sent to our accounting email, which I also got CC'd on, even though I'm not managing that. And it was a company that was, the company said, please take a look below. We are still expecting payment. And they had a quoted email with my email, right? So it was from my own email with, yes, this one has been approved. Appreciate your patience. Accounting, please take care of that, right? So it looked like a genuine email thread forwarded to accounting from me, which was kind of the highest level kind of an accomplishment, so to speak. You know, you've seen someone using your email, especially when you don't have DMARC records or SPF and using your email, but it doesn't seem genuine. You've seen someone texting from a completely random number or completely random email address. These are kind of easier to kind of capture, but a level of sophistication of someone's forwarding email from the executive that, yes, this has been approved with a transactional company that is handling a lot of these payments, you normally don't call the CEO to ask them if they really approve that because they're too busy. And I'm just seeing more and more of these attacks, which is definitely pretty clever and is going to cause a lot of additional issues. And still on the security side, I just think there's a lot to unpack there, and there are lots of executives who just want to get the top nuggets out there. When we talk about two-factor authentication, when we talk about, let's say, text not being a very secure way to obtain a token, when you're talking about passkeys, what are some of the more accurate ways to secure your website right now? Is it authentication apps? Is it passkeys? Is it like using something else? How much should you limit, let's say, rate attempts or login attempts or anything like that? Some of the extra security steps that you'd recommend on an application level or two-factor at least.
The first thing really is to just avoid giving any kind of access at all. That's what I mentioned in the beginning as well. Like, way too many people have accounts to their WordPress websites as an admin. WordPress has so many different roles, and most of the people don't use those roles at all. If you want to give your customer an access to the website, just they could change content, they don't need to be an admin, right? I think these role types need to be looked at into, I think, more accuracy. And I think overall we need to think about whether customers even need to have access to that. Any account with admin privileges should today have two-factor authentication turned on. And I would always recommend not using SMS, of course, because it can be quite easily bypassed. You can do Hijacking there, where you basically obtain the same number and trick the ISP or the telecom basically forward you the messages or basically act behalf of that number.
How easy is Hijacking in practice? I'm pretty interested on, do you need to have a man in the middle of the telecom level, or it's pretty easy to actually copycat the number? Just from a practical standpoint, unless you're like a politician that essentially get a bribery in the telecom level, how easy it is to get that done?
People are basically using social engineering, so they are reaching out to telecom and they are basically playing that they are you and saying that they lost their phone and that they need to I'm traveling abroad, I lost my phone, how can I get access to my phone number? And then they basically are getting a SIM card, or they get an actual eSIM linked to them. So, or they can they have an existing card with there, and then they just change the number. So they buy they already have a SIM card, but they say that I lost my phone. And so they basically go through that process of basically faking that they are you, and then they are getting their basically number assigned to them. I recommend reading about it. It's quite it depends on ISPs. Some ISPs just have a very poor security kind of internal processes. So social engineering can be used to basically obtain those numbers, and then you just do that. The other thing is also spoofing, right? In Estonia, we have this problem all of the time that you see phone calls coming from Estonian numbers, and then after I call them back, they're like, I never called you. But basically, the scammers are basically spoofing random phone numbers and doing the calls. And then if you try to call back to them, it's actually someone else's number. So similar things are also used there.
Super important. And I've heard similar things, particularly on the social engineering end. My kids showed me an episode of Low by Mike with different ways to rob a house, change a house ownership and so forth. And an expert who was actually a convict by the Fed he just said, kind of, we sorted this out and stuff, but essentially it's extremely easy to just call in and say, look, that's me. And we're, again, moving abroad, need to change another React name, or I need to pass it to my daughter or something like that. And then changing ownership or paying for social security numbers to other people and just kind of stealing identity of other people, similar to spoofing, that's using a different number. So yeah, we are indeed getting a lot more of this. And I think it's important to also cover them, not just due to the fact that it's not a WordPress specific thing. And again, I also want to open a pretty large bracket. It's a web thing, it's the internet thing, it's how the AI is operating with these systems, how social engineering works. And
half of the WordPress websites are getting hacked because of all of those things, like everything related to social engineering, poorly protected accounts, everything that someone getting access to a privileged account. Most of the cases, getting access to privileged account is either by getting social engineering you to give that access away voluntarily, or brute forcing your accounts, or trying to basically hack you through your devices and things like that, which all ultimately boils down to your kind of like cyber hygiene that you have in the first place. And then there's, again, as I mentioned, the second part of it is the vulnerabilities, and this is also getting more challenging because we are actually about to release one of our new products of ours, which is basically, as I mentioned, 4 years ago, we started like this program of rewarding ethical hackers for reporting vulnerabilities to us. So we have huge amount of security reports that we've basically processed and dealt with. So over a year, together in partnership with Google, we built essentially like a AI version of a security researcher. So as an input, you just give a random plugin or GitHub repository, and it builds it and its own kind of like context around this entire software, and then comes back to you with a full report of like, here are the security vulnerabilities, here's what the severity is potentially, all based on our previous data. And we already see that the AI that we built is capable of essentially finding vulnerabilities as well as average level security researchers in our entire community, which is now, kind of like bringing us back to a point where we are going to see so many new vulnerabilities being like found in coming years. And also the problem is that every script kiddie, who we call script kiddies, the guys who are like, they never code anything themselves, they are like using someone's like pre-made hacking scripts, and then just they just like kind of like go and like attack everyone. Every script kiddie with AI is becoming like an APT level cyber threat, basically, because they can now use AI to find vulnerabilities, like new ones. Then they can use the AI to automate the exploitation scripts, which means that they don't need to anymore like build an exploit, or like figure out like how to automate attacks against the entire web. They can just use a prompt and tell AI like, hey, here's this security vulnerability. Can you like write a script that is basically going after every IP and trying to exploit it? If it does exploit it, inject backdoor and call back to home. All these things can now be completely automated by AI. So when I told you about like the speed from vulnerability disclosure to weaponization, it was in a matter of hours. We are going to see this amount, or like this timeline, shorten even more. I would say, like, coming, like, looking into the future, I would say that the amount of vulnerabilities that will be found, I think the kind of like the scale of the reasoning why websites are getting hacked, I think it's going to tip even more towards the vulnerabilities that have been found in the websites, just because it is becoming so much easier to quickly exploit vulnerabilities and find zero-day vulnerabilities as well.
okay, that's scary enough. I'm pretty sure that some people are not going to have a good night's sleep tonight. But nevertheless, it's super important, and definitely a great point, especially if script kiddies are able to open up access to large networks like botnets of different IPs so that they don't get throttled and IP limited and all that stuff. It's going to get extremely dangerous.
So you combine it now with what I mentioned in the beginning, is that on the network level, it's getting harder and harder to filter out those attackers, because they can completely mimic regular user. They can use basically like connecting like browser, like headless browsers with AI, where it just goes and like almost like manually, like it can look like they manually exploit it, right? It's getting like significantly harder also to kind of like prevent those attacks if they are not like laser focused at kind of like either fixing those issues or auto mitigating them or things like that.
How does Patchstack help right now? Let's say I'm a mid or small enterprise doing 10, 20 million ARR on top of WordPress. kind of working with an external vendor, or I'm potentially thinking of rebuilding a WordPress, which is happening a lot. We see people moving from Brightspot or Craft or Sitecore, Sitefinity or something else, and I want to own my data. And I'm looking into WordPress as a go-to source. I'm afraid of vulnerability. It's pretty common. WordPress is insecure. I want to own my data and have control, and my editors working with the system, but super scared. So, kind of, what would be the playbook of, okay, you need to have WordPress, and these are hosting providers that we work with, and kind of these are the layers that you need to set up. So essentially, it's find a trusted partner, move to WordPress, go to that host, set up Patchstack, or like within the partnership, set up Cloudflare on top. Like, what would be a playbook for great businesses that still want to trust WordPress?
The ones that we work with, like the main value proposition that we actually have is that we have the visibility about the vulnerabilities before anyone else, because like everyone who is like ethically finding vulnerabilities and reporting them to vendors, this information comes to us either through our own bug bounty program, which is basically like, if we look into the statistics from last year, 52% of all security vulnerabilities out of like ever found in the WordPress ecosystem, we were originally the ones who made that information public, which means that those issues were reported by someone in our community to Patchstack, and then Patchstack was controlling the disclosure process. We work with the vendors, but actually, practically speaking, our visibility into vulnerabilities is even higher than that, because over 600 plugins have already set Patchstack as their security point of contact. So even if like a third-party security researcher finds a vulnerability there and they report it to the vendor directly, all these vulnerability reports are still actually getting processed by our system, so we still have the visibility into it. So that kind of like allows us to provide right now on the market the first kind of detection for those issues, but also because we are producing virtual patches, we can also deploy those virtual patches the moment when those vulnerabilities are found. Speed to mitigation is ultimately the most important thing. We work with a lot of like enterprise agencies, we work with a lot of smaller developers and so forth, but we've tried to build our platform as accessible as possible for everyone. So ultimately, like all you need to really do is like log into, go to patchstack.com, create an account, and then connect the websites with Patchstack, and all of that happens on the background, where Patchstack is essentially building a profile of your website to understand what it's made of, all the components, sends that to Patchstack, and then Patchstack is responding with the corresponding vulnerability alerts and virtual patches that are getting automatically deployed to the site. So if there's a new security vulnerability found, you get essentially the virtual patch, which is a vulnerability specific mitigation rule, automatically deployed to the site and enabled there. So if someone is trying to exploit that vulnerability, they are getting booted out. And then that is also leaving a mark. So ultimately we will, like if you go to patchstack.com database, you see our public vulnerability database there. All vulnerabilities have a marker, whether they are like actively exploited in the wild, and we can even like highly prioritize those vulnerabilities in front of you, which are like also known to actively exploited across other websites and things like that. But ultimately it gives you like the central security dashboard for your websites to understand what kind of components are vulnerable, outdated, abandoned across all of the websites that you have to manage, and you will get like, basically we cover this exposure timeline for you when maybe there's no update available, or maybe you need to have your developers actually validate whether they want to update the plugins to a fixed version, whether there's any breaking changes present and things like that. We cover that entire kind of like exposure timeline with the virtual patching, so the sites won't get basically hacked in the middle of that process. And we do exactly the same thing with hosting companies, obviously, and so forth as well. But this platform that the hosting companies are using is exactly the same platform that our customers who just come to our website, sign up, and have Patchstack account, what they are using as well. So it's it's meant to be very lightweight, very simple, and very easy to access.
How are the virtual patches getting deployed? Is it a must-use plugin? Is it something that happens on a network layer prior to that? Like, are you hooking into the DNS server services similarly to kind of Cloudflare? How is that working?
For virtual patches to work, you need to have two things. One thing is obviously threat intelligence, to be able to even know about what vulnerabilities there are, because every single virtual patch is on spec made for individual vulnerabilities. So right now, Patchstack has over 11,000 unique virtual patches, which is like by far the largest collection of any kind of security rules in the WordPress ecosystem. You need to be able to know exactly when and where to deploy that, because you don't want to have your website kind of like run through 11,000 rules for every single page request, right? One of the things is obviously then threat intelligence, having that visibility, and then basically building those virtual patches in the first place and being able to do that very fast. So that's already something that we have going on because of the visibility that we have into the new vulnerabilities. The second part is basically software composition analysis. Like, you need to have visibility of what the website itself is made of, because otherwise you don't know what kind of corresponding vulnerability or like virtual patches they need. And for that, you need to actually be hooked into the application. So you need to, the only place where you can have this visibility is inside of the website. For that, we need to run it as basically like a WordPress plugin. And the third part, which is also very important, is that you need to be able to run virtual patches without zero false positives. That's the only way how you can deploy them with confidence every single time automatically, because that's where the virtual patches value is coming from. The fact that you can deploy them without thinking, basically, like whenever vulnerability is there, you deploy the virtual patch. If you would need to think about that, then there is like some process around like who needs to think about that, when they need to think about that, and by that time they might already get hacked. For us to be able to actually essentially like offer 0% of false positives is that we need to have also visibility into the sessions. So we need to make sure that, for example, if a virtual patch is being deployed for remote code execution in a very popular page builder, this is something that happened last year, where if the only way to basically mitigate that vulnerability is to block off entire function, then you need to make sure that you are able to do that in such a way that you don't basically interfere with the users and so forth. So we had a case where we had to create a virtual patch like that, but then at the same time leave administrator privileged users out of it. We were able to basically mitigate the vulnerability for anyone who was not authenticated to see a page builder, but for those who had to actually have access to the page builder functionality, the virtual patch was not basically activated. So that allowed the website not to break down and things like that, but at the same time the vulnerabilities was fully mitigated. For us to be able to do everything we do with virtual patches, we actually need to deploy it into the WordPress like runtime. So we hook into the WordPress application, get the full visibility, and then we deploy it automatically there. And these rules are basically like, it's like a JSON based formatting system. It can be programmatic, so we can actually deploy if-else arguments. We don't deploy like regex rules or something like that. We literally like always good example is like if there's a SQL injection vulnerability in a specific function, we already know what function it is vulnerable, what the actual function was supposed to be doing compared to what it's doing, so we can actually put sanitization in front of the application on our own kind of virtual patches. So, for example, if there's SQL injection vulnerability that the function was originally supposed to only accept numbers, then we can create a virtual patch saying like, you can only accept numbers. We don't need to think about like, whether there's like someone is trying to push like union select and whatnot, kind of like SQL injection exploitation kind of like patterns there. We don't need to look into the patterns at all. We're like, is it number? Is it not? If it's not the number, then basically bye-bye. And that is what is allowing us to basically have super strict security rules, very, very, very highly effective, without actually causing false positives.
That's pretty amazing once again, and kudos to all the work that you've done. That's extremely helpful, and I'm definitely going to make sure that we're going to reach as many executives as possible and make sure that WordPress is as secure as possible. And one of the last, but kind of the most, I'd say, uncomfortable question, but there are two types of people who were already hacked or are going to be hacked, right?
Yeah.
So things happen, right? Could be software engineering account, could be phishing, could be someone's leaking password or so. What's the best course of action when a website gets hacked? Especially if there's potentially a breach that's been in the system for a few weeks, which is pretty common. How should executives approach that so that they can sleep well at night and say, okay, my WordPress is going to be secure with Patchstack going forward. And if something happens, I have a reverse course of action that's not going to completely nuke my business.
So that's a good point, because again, security is never 100%. There's so many multiple ways of how, like, even if you run Patchstack, we cannot guarantee that you maybe have like a outsourced administrator from some other country who accidentally leaked his passwords and someone was basically taking the site over like that. Or if maybe we've seen cases where agencies are basically installing null plugins because they're trying to save money. So they're building websites with already basically pre-packaged malware, right? So we've seen all kinds of crazy stuff, which we cannot really do anything about it, because if you voluntarily upload malware to your website, that it's obviously going to get infected. What really maybe I'm not sure if it's the right word, but what a little bit bothers me in the WordPress ecosystem is that getting hacked is somehow like normalized. It's like the only place, or like only ecosystem what I even know, where malware cleanup is like presented as a security feature, which is completely crazy. Imagine if you're like going to the Google Cloud and they're just saying, by the way, your plan also includes that like if you get hacked, we're gonna wipe your servers or something like that. You don't want that to happen. You want to have like if you're getting hacked, I want to know why. I want to have like an understanding of what went wrong. And I feel that this is often like very overlooked thing in the WordPress ecosystem, is that people are so like focused on the consequences rather than the root cause. That very often you go with like, oh, my website got hacked, I'm going to go to like a hosting company that is offering malware cleanups. They're just doing something there. You never get like the root cause analysis. You always get like just like, oh yeah, like we deleted 50 different malware on your website, right? So I think something that I would encourage people to do more is like have very good logging. So store the logs somewhere where they cannot be deleted. And obviously the second thing is like also have a visibility and log the vulnerabilities as well. Logging the vulnerabilities can also help you pinpoint back into like where you have had exposure. So you can build exposure timeline based on that, right? So you can see like, okay, I have the website that, and then over the past 6 months there were situations where there was like vulnerabilities found in different plugins, and you can see like where you basically have like a red exposure timeline where the sites are essentially where the site was basically completely exposed to a specific vulnerability. And then you go back to the logs and you can see whether anything sketchy happened during that time frame. That just helps you to like speed up the process of like finding what could have been the root cause, and then acting on top of that. But I think backups is very important to have in that case, and that's why I always say that you need to make sure that the backups themselves are also scanned, because in many cases the websites are basically infected for a longer period of time. Because whenever you see a website being hacked with like defacements or where there's like very obvious like traffic kind of like redirection and things like that, this is like the bottom of the iceberg, or like top of the iceberg really. The bottom of the iceberg is like your site is being infected and used a botnet basically, where their intention is to stay hidden so they can have control over as many websites as possible, and then they conduct additional attacks against different companies. And especially who need to be very careful about that are the enterprises who have like a high value domains, because hackers are trying to get into their websites, whether it's WordPress, whatever CMS. They try to get in there so they have like a foot inside of the domain space, and then they could use that access that they have to your website to host phishing pages that would look completely legit for your customers, because it's coming from your own website basically. So it's like a leverage they use for very deep cyber kind of like attacks. We just had like a discussion last week with someone who works in Mandiant, which is like a Google's threat intelligence company, and they said that they worked multiple times with a company called CrowdStrike, and CrowdStrike has always said like every time they like deal with like companies getting breached, and like in many cases when they do incident response, there's always a problem where their like main website got hacked and then it was used as a leverage to get deeper into the network. So it's not only about protecting your website, it's about protecting your entire business.
It's essentially just as every other device that you have. If your phone is hacked, it's primarily used to steal your passwords or keep track of communication or pass it elsewhere. Same goes for like keylogging on your website. It's not just getting hacked as a one-off event, it's kind of as an individual instance. It's getting access to more information, stealing more data, or using for intercept, for additional listening, and so forth. So that's a super important takeaway that I love to kind of get it wrapped up on. Super powerful. Once again, pretty sure we're going to end up having lots of sliced reels and shorts and kind of just smaller bits and kind of nuggets of wisdom that we share with other enterprises over time. As a kind of final piece of advice, kind of what would be your single sentence stay safe type of call-out action to enterprises going for open source software? Or why should they pick up open source regardless of the fact that vulnerabilities exist?
I think open source is still the most secure software that you can use because of all the eyes that are kind of like have been able to go over it. I think especially now moving forward with AI as well, like there is going to be so much more proprietary code going forward because a lot of the developers are just going to use AI that comes up with something which is going to be, there's going to be a lot of security problems, going forward with that. But yeah, ultimately WordPress is also a good example of security. Like it's a platform that runs like almost half of the web, but WordPress core haven't had like a serious vulnerability for a long time. It's a very mature software. Like everyone can look into it and like try to find security vulnerabilities, but there's nothing in there. So maybe that will change over time when the AI capabilities get stronger in terms of like finding like even more like edge case scenarios for security vulnerabilities. But the reason why WordPress as a platform is so secure is because it's open source. All we need to just kind of like figure out and do is that plugins would be as secure as well. But that is a lot more work. But yeah, we have tools available for enterprises to stay protected from those things as well.
Thank you very much once again for the insights. Oliver, that was extremely helpful. Everyone, if you have any follow-up questions, please drop them in the comments. I'm going to pass them along to Oliver, and definitely go sign up for Patchstack. That's pretty much it. You're going to get an analysis of your website. You're going to stay safe at night and going to get all the virtual patches delivered to your website, and you're immediately going to increase the level of security of your website. Thanks again, and see you in the next episode.